Hey kiddos, we are going to be talking about Units 3 and Units 4 today. So Unit 3 is population and Unit 4 is all that geology stuff you love so much. First of all, let's start talking about where we are in the levels of organization. So we've talked about biomes, which are types of ecosystems. Then if you look at a specific ecosystem here, you can see that that is comprised of communities interacting with the non-living components. And then there are populations, which are individual species that live in that particular area. And then you get down to the species level or the organism. So we're going to be focusing right now on populations. Populations are described in a variety of ways. They can include things like abundance or the number of organisms in a population. In this case, it's oftentimes represented by the letter N, which means the number in the total population, or little n, which means a subsample of that total population. Density is how many organisms are living in a unit area. Sex ratio talks about how many males to females there are, and an age structure diagram is oftentimes used to model both the abundance and the sex ratio in a population because that can help us make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. Another way that we can talk about populations is discussing their geographic range. As you can see, the cattle egret here was introduced to South America and its range has changed over the time. Similarly, populations are not static, they're always changing. But as they're introduced to new areas, they can have impacts on native populations. Native populations are populations that naturally have lived and do live in an area. An endemic population is a type of species that only lives in one area and is sometimes susceptible to invasive species. Invasive species are species that are introduced to an area, oftentimes have no predators, reproduce rapidly, and therefore start to compete for resources of the native populations and can impact those populations. Non-natives, however, are introduced to a new area, but because they have a limited population growth or maybe there's a crossover predator, they typically don't outcompete native populations and so don't have a massive ecological impact. Also associated with range may be the distribution of a population within that range. This can be influenced by social structure or the distribution of resources in a particular area. For example, clumped distribution has a tendency to happen when there's competition for a particular resource, like let's say organisms cluster around a pond, and or it can be due to complicated social structures. So if organisms have highly interactive social structures like packs of wolves, then you're going to find clusters of those populations distributed across their geographic range. Uniform distribution usually happens when there's high competition for a specific resource or mate. In this case, you can see the penguins look very uniformly distributed because if they get too close to each other, they will peck each other to death. So they are exactly one pecking distance away from the next neighbor in their nesting site. Random distribution usually happens when there's no competition for resources, there's no high social structure, so it's just there's plenty of resources and it's just a randomized distribution. Wherever that seed landed, that's where it's going to grow. Like I've said previously, populations, just like ranges, are not static. There's always growth and there's always loss within a population, and they can have minute fluctuations on a daily basis. Generally, we look at trends in populations, not those minute fluctuations. Increases in a population size can come from birth or it can come from immigration. Immigration, I think capital I for N to the population, and populations can decrease due to death or emigration, and I think of emigration as E for exit. When we're looking at populations, we use models and we use calculations in order to make predictions about what's going to happen in that population. In order to do that, we need to understand some basic math associated with population growth and population density as well as distribution. We can make some predictions about population growth by looking at the fertility of the population, which is defined by the average number of live births occurring per 1,000 individuals. The CBR, or the crude birth rate, is the number of live births in a year divided by the population times 1,000. So that gives you of the 1,000 individuals. We have seen this sheet before, and we are not going to go over all of the calculations right now because we've been practicing that in other areas of the classroom. But I just wanted to remind you that this was the unit where we talked about all these different calculations and the law of 70. I might take some time to practice these in one of your guidebooks or something along those lines. That we talked about within this unit was density dependent and density independent limiting factors on a population. So if you remember that populations typically don't always grow exponentially because eventually they're going to encounter some sort of limiting resource, which is then going to cause the population to level out at the maximum carrying capacity of a specific ecosystem. The things that cause that evening out of the population are either going to be density dependent or are going to be density dependent limiting factors. So those are things like competition, disease. As densities of populations increase, you're going to have an increase of transmission of disease, parasites, and even of predation or hunting. Density independent factors can limit a population, but they are typically fluctuative, meaning that you get hit with a volcano and that decreases the population, but that may not happen again for another million years. Oftentimes when we think of graphing population growth, we think of that graph on the left-hand side, which is exponential growth. But exponential growth cannot go on forever because there are limiting factors on our planet. Eventually, the growth of the organism will have to start to decrease. And like I said, it should stabilize around the carrying capacity, which is how many organisms that particular ecosystem can stably support over a period of time. Typically, a species is going to hover around this carrying capacity, represented oftentimes by a capital K, if it is a K-selected species. K-selected species are typically lower reproducing organisms. They also give high infant care, and they have a tendency to have more of their infants reach adulthood. Whereas our selected species have a tendency to vacillate along the carrying capacity because they reproduce so quickly and they're so impacted by other environmental factors. Oftentimes their mortality is density independent. Another way that we look at R and K selection is we look at survivorship curves. So K-selected species have a tendency, most of them, to survive until adulthood, where they die of old age, whereas as you go closer and closer to more R-selected species, you'll have organisms that kind of just decline at a constant rate because of heavy predation, or you'll have organisms where very few of them make it actually to adulthood, and once they do, then they slowly die due to old age. Like I said, if you look at carrying capacity and how these organisms approach it, it's very different. This is a K-selected species. Because they are so density independent, they're managed that way, and so they don't have a tendency to vacillate along that carrying capacity line. Right now, scientists do not agree on Earth's carrying capacity for the human population. We have been growing exponentially. It does look like we are leveling off, and we think that as we approach that carrying capacity, we're going to be somewhere around 11.2 billion individuals. Just like with all other populations, impacts to the human population are going to come through immigration and birth, causing increases in that population size, and emigration and death causing decreases in that population size. Oftentimes we do use things like total fertility and other parameters to describe human populations that we don't typically use in animal populations. Oftentimes human populations will be described by age structure diagrams. You will need to know these for the AP exam. So if you see an age structure diagram that is deeply pyramided, in that case, you have a lot of young offspring that are moving into the reproductive age, and a lot of offspring, or a lot of individuals who are in the reproductive age, much more so than are in the retirement age. Okay, you can see that as a population goes through demographic transitions, that growth rate starts to slow down due to developing resources. And we'll talk about this in a second, but this looks like a slowly growing population. This is a stable population. You can see that there's not a lot of growth going in between here and here. And then this is a decreasing population like you would find in some countries in Europe. Some of the major things that influence population growth rate or human population growth rate and total fertility of the population would be the education of women, the access to family planning methods, better health care, and better nutrition, because that helps to postpone the death rate or the death age of organisms, but also nutrition allows for greater infant survivorship. Most populations undergo demographic transition, where you start off in a country that is not developed, so a developing country, and they typically have to have a lot of births in order to make up for the high infant mortality and the high death rate of the adult population due to lack of access to nutrition and healthcare. So typically they will have tons of births, but they have a very low survivorship towards adulthood. And so that would be represented by this type of age structure diagram. However, as a country starts to become more developed, what ends up happening is the first thing that happens is there's a better access to nutrition as things become industrialized, and there's a better access to imported foods, and there's an increase in healthcare. So what ends up happening is that the death rate starts to decrease, but the birth rate stays high due to cultural influences. And so there's usually a big spike in the population. And then what ends up happening in phase 3 is that due to the expense of maintaining children, the birth rate starts to decrease. There's also better education for women, typically better access to family planning. And so that birth rate is going to decrease and the death rate is going to stay low, so that population starts to become more stable. Then what can happen is that that population, if it becomes stable enough, like couples will just choose to have one child because it's really expensive to raise a child in a city, or things along those lines, and you may see some decreasing in the population. They say that by 2030, more than 1/2 of the world's population will live in urban areas. And this is good because that will start to be seen in the human population growth models. However, there are some concerns that will have to be addressed as that occurs, because right now we have a tendency in urban areas to use a greater amount of resources than suburban areas or even rural areas use. For instance, if you're in a rural area and you don't have access to a grocery store, you'll have a tendency not to scrap food as quickly. Or if you have less access to water, you're going to really make sure that you minutely manage that resource. However, if you have easy access to all of those things like you do in urban areas, oftentimes it develops into consumeristic societies that are over-consuming and under-recycling, and so that can heavily impact our resources, as a huge chunk of our population do live in urban areas. This shift necessitates us focusing on a sustainable development of our planet and our urban areas. I know it's an elusive goal, but if we could fight poverty, if we could increase education, if we could have gender equality, if we could have access to clean water and quality resources, if we could have decent work or work availability for all human beings where they could bring in enough income to contribute to those sustainability factors, then we would have a idealistic country, but a beautiful country where there would be reduced violence, aggression, and reduced load on our overall planet. I know it sounds like a lofty goal, but remember, it all starts with each individual. That means you, right? So remember when we calculated how many plants it would take if everybody on the world lived just like you? And sometimes you guys were up to 14 or 15 planets. I'm wondering how well you've done as far as reducing your ecological footprint, or the amount of space and resources it takes just to maintain you. Step 1 is usually, what can I do? We're now going to move on to Unit 4.